world is heading into trouble as inflation erodes our wealth. Could our living standards decrease dramatically over time if the inflationary pressures don't subside anytime soon? Closer to home, Nancy Pelosi, House Speaker, has just visited Taiwan last week, prompting worries that an escalation of tensions between China and the U.S. could happen. Could we see a potential full-blown hot war? Well, these are the very important and troubling issues that we'll be discussing with Dr. Ron Paul, host of the Liberty Report and former congressman. Dr. Paul, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you as always. Honored to have you back and get your thoughts. Now, I want to revisit some of the calls that you've made in an interview that we've done together in January 2021, right after the inauguration of President Biden, where we discussed some of the upcoming challenges that America would face. You've made a number of correct calls, starting with the fact that Americans might get poorer and the economic conditions might worsen. Let's take a listen to the first clip.
So the debt is going to be there. And the only way I see that this debt will be liquidated, which is absolutely necessary over a period of time to get the market working again in a true sense of the word, and that is going to be through liquidation of debt by inflation. They're working hard at it. And the tragedy is they're going to be successful about it. Every day I get another article of prices have gone up, steel prices have gone up, and they've never admitted to the prices that have gone up before. And this whole thing, if they don't restore sanity to the most important price in the whole economy, and that is the cost of borrowing. Interest rates. Interest rates are very, very important if you want to have any market economy. You know, in a Soviet type system, they don't have a market rate of interest, and they also had no production, and the system had to collapse. But now we don't have that, and that's why I think the country is going to get much, much poorer.
All right, so you've made a number of important points there. Let's touch on the last point you've made, that you think the country is going to get a lot poorer. Now, you've made that statement in 2021, early 2021. It's been a year and a half now, Dr. Paul. As you can see, real wages, as measured by the wages of workers age 16 and over, adjusted for inflation, have actually been declining since 2020. So that does illustrate your point. Do you see any other evidence, Dr. Paul, for our standard of living falling, and as you have said in the past, Americans becoming poorer?
Well, I think in general, when you have inflationary pressures that comes from increasing the money supply, it's never even. Everybody doesn't suffer alike. And that's one of the problems with it, because some people suffer more than others, and some people make money and make more profits when there's inflation. But the inflation tells you whether the people are getting wealthy or not, or poorer. And one characteristic of this situation is labor and wages never keep up with prices going up once, you know, the price movement starts. See, for years, we were printing money like crazy. We tripled the money supply between 08 and 22. And you know, the inflation didn't seem to be bad, and the stock market was doing well. But when the prices in the retail market started going up, they lose control. But the wages never keep up, and that's why there's resentment between the wealthy and the poor and the middle class, because that's, to me, the most destructive thing about inflation. Some people say, well, what if all the you know, why is inflation so bad, inflating the money supply? That is because you know, everybody's salary is going to go up, and everybody's prices are going to go up, and it'll be even Steven. But it doesn't work that way. That's right. Some people suffer, and that's why the real test is, what are the housewives and what are the shoppers saying when they buy groceries, and what are they saying when they buy gasoline?
Well, they're probably voicing their disappointment over the fewer number of goods, or the lower quality of goods that they're able to afford now, Dr. Paul. This is a very scary chart that I'm looking at from the St. Louis Fed. Real wages have been increasing steadily over time since the early 90s, peaked around 2020, and then sharp decline since 2020. I think Americans are wondering now whether or not you feel it, but the data shows that we are getting poorer as we are able to afford less. And we are not able to beat inflation through our wages. What can be done to reverse this downtrend, Dr. Paul?
Well, we have to recognize what it is. And one principle is that if an individual or a company or a government, a country spends beyond its means and lives beyond its means, it will be destined to live beneath its means because you have to pay for it. I think that there's a lot of effort. It's the biggest political issue going on right now, but they're starting with the wrong premise because there have not been very many people in government. I met about 4 that I considered an understanding of the free market and why you should have sound money, why you should have commodity money, why you should not have interference with interest rates. You shouldn't have a central bank. And that is where the real problem is. But if you start with, this is a management problem. Oh, it's Powell's fault, or it's somebody, we need better management and all. No, we need a different system. This system doesn't work. It has never worked in history. And we had a token relationship of our dollar to gold all through my lifetime until August 15, 1971, when that was severed. And then we lost the unit of account. There's no definition of a unit of account, and that makes for a chaotic market, and it makes it very difficult. And all the government can do and all the politicians can do, and just look at it, spend more money. And right now, today, they're bragging, and the Democrats are bragging about Biden. You know, he is on a roll. He got 4 big bills passed. He's going to solve the problem of inflation. Well, they all spent money. And it's all inflationary. So it's all a farce. But I think the basic problem, they come from the wrong premise that you can have a world currency, which is so important, don't have market interest rates, and then try to run an economy because you don't have savings. The people don't save. That's not where capital comes from. Capital comes, in a sense, from the Federal Reserve, creating more to dilute the capital that exists. And it's just it's so far removed from a market economy, so people don't know about it, and they don't argue the case. They don't teach this, so therefore they're just looking for better managers and better legislators and people who have to sacrifice a little bit, all kinds of nonsense, or change the definition. It causes recessions and depression. But no, we don't have a recession. We just changed the definition of it to make it sound better. But we can't get away with that for very long. The people are waking up. They know with it. They woke up over all the nonsense associated with COVID and all the lockdown, and the people are waking up now. Right now, there's an enlightenment about how much money should we be sending to Ukraine? What are we doing there? And we've been doing this. We've been doing it since World War II. We fight these wars. They're not declared, and there's no end to them. And because we have a special situation, wealthy country, a lot of natural resources, a remnant of the free market, and people trust the Americans to print money because everybody in the world wants the dollar now because things are rocky. But that's not the solution. What we need is a sound currency and an understanding of how a market works, and why we should never have a group of people in secret decide what interest rates ought to be, because they don't know. You can't. People ask me, what would you do, Ron, if you were there and you had to set interest rate? I go, I'd resign. I don't know what the interest rate should be. The market will. Without that, you can't run an economy very well.
All right, I want to touch on Ukraine later on in this interview, but let's revisit what you said in my interview with you in January 2021, which leads into your discussion about a new world economic system and a new global currency. Now, you have said that the current economic system needs to collapse, and you have likened it to possibly what happened to the Soviet Union in the late 80s, early 90s. Take a listen to this clip.
$6 trillion we just spent, bailing out people. That was a temporary reprieve. To me, that's like giving a patient a shot of morphine because they're addicted. And we're addicted to this type of economy, and that's why they can't stop. And that's why it's going to get much worse. But we have a job, those of us who are in the business of spreading a message, as you are, to talk about sensible economics. And hopefully they'll come to their senses. I think the collapse will come. It's going to surprise everybody, because I was really surprised what happened to the Soviet system. I was in the service in the 60s and watched the Cold War very closely. And then all of a sudden, boom, it disappeared. So let's hope and pray for our system to change, as peaceful as that was.
Now, Dr. Paul, let's come back to the present day. Are you suggesting then that the American economy will collapse like the Soviet Union did?
Well, we don't know that. And I was suggesting there that it can be a lot more graceful than anybody would ever dream, because in the 50s and the 60s, I mean, the conversation was, how are we going to solve the problem of a nuclear exchange? And of course, the day I was, got my draft notice was there was a missile crisis in Cuba. I mean, that was very, very real. So that is, it was a concern and still is a concern, but the collapse, I think that I'm talking about, is the inevitable collapse of the economy, because we won't be able to afford it, and that can come quickly. And the downturn can be very, very vicious. It can be very, very fast, and the only chance we have now, see. It's not like you have to be clairvoyant to predict, inflation and a recession. But the one reason why I continue to talk about it and think it's important is that it doesn't have to happen. We should have prevented it. It's sort of like trying to stay out of a war. We could stay out of a war by maybe making sure they declare the war and know what they're doing. But no, right now, the inflation has occurred. The debt is there. We're not going to pay it off in a normal, honorable, moral fashion. So we are going to continue until the market wins. The market always wins, and the market will say there will be a liquidation of debt. It's been known for thousands of years that the debt gets wiped out, and then we have to do it. But we don't have a replacement for it. Marxists that are very vocal right now, they actually like the idea of chaos, because that gives them a chance to clean the slate and start this new world order with a Marxist system. And of course, that's what we have to work to avoid. And right now, it's up for grabs.
Okay. Well, all right. So this economic collapse. Now, Dr. Paul, we've had recessions many times in the past. Recessions are normal parts of the business cycle. But what's different this time? What's different now that would lead this recession into an economic collapse?
Well, we don't know what the precipitating event will be. We don't know whether it will start tomorrow or whether it will be a bankruptcy announcement, something to it. But the bubble is there, the debt is there, and I would say the measurement of debt is the best way to tell how distorted it is, the system is, and therefore it's fragile. It's and we haven't. It's sort of like we built this huge skyscraper, but we never had a measuring rod, so it was a mishmash. It was just building it, but they didn't have a yardstick. And we built this economy, and we don't even have a yardstick, and so the values change, and it will stop. The debt has to be liquidated. I mean, the preference I would have is, well, quit spending, balance the budget, don't accumulate any more debt. But politically, having spent a little bit of time in Washington, it's not going to happen. They're not going to do it. So the market will win out. Just like the market wins out, the government can do things to sort of suppress prices going up, but the market wins out. And the market went out with the breakdown of Bretton Woods. They artificially told us the dollar was as good as gold. And on the surface, it looked like it, but the predictions were correct. Is when I got involved in studying this in the 60s, they said the Bretton Woods would collapse. And that was my confirmation in August 15th of 71, is it did collapse. The market said, you're faking, you're lying, you're printing money like crazy, and you will not be able to honor the dollar at $35 an ounce. So, and that's what will happen to our burden of debt. we will finally just printing more money right now. You know, when COVID hit and the downturn was occurring, you know, it sort of the extra money did perk things up. People got checks. And, you know, and it helped the stock market and things like that. But that's all temporary. And the comparison I made was it's sort of like a drug addict. I mean, if they're addicted, they always feel better when they get it. So when you inject the money until the point where the patient and the economy is so sick, just injecting more money instead of temporary reprieve, you get the confirmation, we're doing the same thing again. This is terrible. The prices are not going up 10% a year. They're going up 30% a year. That's been more of the history of monetary policy than that the government and a country turns around and changes their way of living.
How would you address some left-wing policies that aim to solve the problem of not paying off our debt? For example, we could potentially raise taxes, we could potentially nationalize a few businesses to increase government revenues, and perhaps we can even pursue modern monetary theory, MMT, where we have infinite money printing that's just going to pay off our debt. How do you feel about these policies?
With hands-off position, the debt is liquidated. In 1921, we had a serious depression that lasted for a year or so, and GDP crashed. But back then, they didn't believe in propping it up and prolonging the agony. In a year and a half, the depression was over. But what we are doing now is we prolong it. So there's a bigger bubble, bigger distortions, more regulations, more confusion, and it's a much bigger problem that has to correct, which means that there has to be a default. And the default comes from paying off all the bills with printed money. I mean, what was the reason why our government, our Federal Reserve in particular, for the last 10 or 15 years, I think it's since 2012, that our policy was, we need more price inflation. Why aren't the prices going up? They want something to help liquidate the debt, take down the real debt. So they want to, well, what we want is 2% inflation, 2% destruction of the currency, which always never made any sense to me about that. Why would they do this? I said, well, you wait until you get 2%. You're going to have 4% before you know it. And nobody remembers when you had prices going up at a 2% rate, probably for about 6 months maybe, or not even that long. And right now, I think they're destined to go much higher. The debt has to be liquidated. It'll be liquidated because they will continue to print the money and the debt will be paid off. It'll be, some people will just default and not pay. It'll be sort of like the student debt, the student debt, that's just gonna fade away because they already don't have to make payments on it. So there will be a lot of that type of default where they just quit paying. But the big default for government can't just say, okay, that's a treasury bill. We're not going to give you any money for that. We'll give you your money back. Right. But instead of giving you $1 worth of dollar, it's going to be worth about 10 cents.
All right, I'll just close the discussion on economics with this question, Dr. Paul. Suppose this economic collapse you're talking about does inevitably happen. What does this mean for the average American? How will we feel it?
High prices. See, a lot of us talk about the value of the currency, and the dollar has been strong, against other currencies because they're worse than we are. But I tell people that's not your measurement of the dollar and your well-being, because you measure it when you go buy stuff. And if you're running out of money, most people still say, we don't have enough money. Government should send me more money so I can buy my gasoline. But the prices are going up because of this liquidation, and it's a terrible position to be in to allow it to run. No politician could say, okay, just let it go. No, you have to do it. So you print more money. And the big question is, which is worse? Stopping the printing of money, or printing it and then lead to this runaway inflation. And there's no answer. They're both bad because they're correcting the mistakes. We will be living beneath our means. The real tragedy and the political threat is that some people will be able to preserve their wealth and even benefit. And it is true. Sometimes people get wealthier while other people get poorer. But the middle class and the poor right now, the poor are out on the streets, and the middle class can't pay their bills, and it's just starting. There's still a lot of debt. You know, during that period of time when we tripled the money supply, prices went, or the national debt went from 10 trillion to $30 trillion. I mean, and people, well, but things are still seem to be okay.
So Dr. Paul,
they're not okay.
Just to reiterate then, and we'll move on to politics, just to reiterate, are you saying that there is no way to fight this inflation because prices will get higher, or your words? There's nothing the Fed can do, there's nothing Congress can do? I mean, Fed is...
There is. It's just politically nobody will allow them.
Okay.
No, I mean, let's say they would...
What should they do? Ideally, what should they do?
Who? The government.
The government, any branch of the government.
Well, what they should do is quit spending money, bring all our troops home, give up on the welfare state, and turn us into a republic. You know, this is not like this is most of our lives or most of the time of our of the United States existence that we had this type of system. It got much worse in the Depression, and it got much worse after we were tempted with all the largesse that we owned, you know, because we had the reserve currency of the world. So it's a moral principle as well as any. But no, it's a terrible predicament to be in. And what I'm saying, though, is it's inexorable. It's going to last. It's going to happen no matter what the government does. But if I did what I wanted to do, you know, I might be in office for a week, you know, or so. I mean, the people would be so outraged that because it is such a mess. So so going in the other direction and say, well, okay, you mean you're still going to keep printing the money? And I happen to think long term, just keep printing the money in the chaos of a Venezuela or something like that, and the loss of liberty. We already are sensing, and the people are sensing, a loss of liberty right now for various reasons. And that, to me, is what's most vital and most crucial for me is that liberty. I think if we did what I'm talking about, it would be very, very bad. But to retain one thing, I talk about investments and all. What can I do to protect my investment? Should I buy gold, have land? Yeah, you should try to do all those things. But the whole thing is the most important investment anybody can make, and where I spend most of my time, is trying to get people to understand what the principles of liberty are. Because I believe if you just cut everything off, get rid of the income tax, get rid of the Federal Reserve, have sound money, and get rid of most of the regulation and just let people go, people say, I'd do pretty well if I could just keep all that money I'm making. So no, you would have a tragic, terrible mess for a year or so. But that would be the best thing to do. But politically, it will not be acceptable.
Well, they're actually doing the opposite now. Speaking of spending, we're not spending. In this case, they are spending. The Inflation Reduction Act hasn't been passed by the House yet. It's been moved through the Senate. $369 billion in spending on fighting climate change, and a 15% proposed minimum tax on corporations, or just on a higher level. What do you think of this concept?
Well, everything's there is going to make things much worse. It puts pressure on the monetary authorities. It diminishes the competitions because all that stuff, they start dealing with climate change. It's just more regulations. So there is a tax and a cost for regulations, and it just moves it on rapidly. As the conditions get worse, the demand for more bailouts will increase, and that's what we have noticed. I mean, in 2008, we never got out of 2008, and even before the recession started in 21 and 22, it was part of the business cycle. But then the COVID hit. We can blame COVID. COVID made it worse. But the conditions were that we were already moving into a period of time. And even now, the allowance for the monetary system to adjust a little bit isn't permitted because, we still have the reserve currency of the world. We have been tempted to just continue to do it. But there's no time in history it's ever worked. So
Yeah.
we ought to plan, and people ought to know what sound money means. That's the important thing. And most people aren't taught, and they don't care because the government has always come to their rescue. Look how quickly the checks came out. And they weren't all from Democrats. The checks came out, the Republican Party too. Just write checks. Everybody gets $1,200 or more than that, and they're still doing that. And
Yes.
if the market gets a little worse next week, they'll send more money and just speed up the deterioration of the value of the dollar.
Okay, let's move on to foreign policy now. I think the question that stumped a lot of people is, what was House Speaker Nancy Pelosi doing in Taiwan?
I don't know. She was causing trouble is what she was doing. And it makes no sense. She fits in. You could argue the case that she is doing the job of the people who work diligently to cause the most chaos possible on our streets and to aggravate. I mean, just to go over there, our policy of sending our ships and our planes and Nancy Pelosi over there just to aggravate, the communists and the Chinese. Why do it? It makes no sense. And I don't know why she does it. I can't read it in her mind, but she probably thinks she's a great diplomat. And but she can't possibly be a diplomat and go over there and make things worse. I think what has happened in the last year or so, our relations with China has gotten lost worse. The one thing that Nixon and Kissinger did, and they were far from my favorite president. Nixon and Kissinger actually did something I thought was worthwhile because I was very much aware of the Korean War. One of my teachers had been redrafted, he'd been in World War II, and sent over to Korea to fight this war, and he was killed. And it's even then, when I was in high school, I said, why are they doing this? So especially since the founders told us how to prevent that nonsense. Sound money, you can't print money, and you had to use gold and silver as legal tender. You can't go to war willy-nilly. You have to have the people support it, with the congressman voting for it, know why you're going to war and vote for it, and have a precise job to do. That was basically what happened in World War II, and it was over. Just think how quick that war was compared to what we've been doing in the Middle East, and now in Ukraine, and now in Syria. And we never stop, because the biggest crime is that we have a monetary system that is still on its last legs, but the people around the world have no other place to go, and except, I would say, maybe, because maybe somebody's going to come up. It's ironic to think that some people in Russia and China are talking about, we ought to prepare for this. Maybe we, even hint about using gold. So that may occur, something like that. But right now, that's not on the immediate horizon.
Well, one thing that her visit did do was bring the attention of the public to the Taiwan Relations Act. In fact, Pelosi herself wrote an op-ed to the Washington Post, and she was quoting from the act. And she goes on to say that our congressional delegation's visit should be seen as an unequivocal statement that America stands with Taiwan. And she said that the commitment of the Americans to Taiwan's democracy was ironclad, with her words. Now, let's revisit the Taiwan Relations Act, signed into action in 1979 by Jimmy Carter. And to my understanding, it guarantees that the Americans should send arms supplies to Taiwan, but not necessarily provide military support in case there is armed conflict. Is that correct? What exactly is the Americans?
Yes, but I think Pelosi upped it. It sounded to me like we would go to war, and it's that impression that I think is so bad. It is so wrong for us to get into these treaties. See, I don't think any of those treaties. I think one of the worst things we did. I think Robert Taft was exactly right, that we should even be in NATO. Here we are, signing up, and we're going to be defending Finland. And if Russia steps over the border up there and takes an oil well, we're supposed to send our kids over there and fight that war makes no sense.
There is an argument to be made for maintaining a presence in Southeast Asia and potentially a presence in Taiwan. Taiwan currently is the world's largest producer of semiconductors, for example. If that were to fall in the hands of the communist Chinese, that would strain the global supply chain potentially. Taiwan has historically been used as a staging ground for wars in Asia, Korean War, for example. So it is a strategic choke point on multiple fronts. Should the Americans be committed to defending the island? That is the question. Should.
Well, no, we shouldn't be, but we should be interested in economic exchanges there. And that's why Nixon and Kissinger were valuable, because how many billions of dollars has transpired between China and the United States? And I have a strong belief that the founders were correct. The more you trade with a country, the less likely you are to fight with a country. And we should be trading with them. It should be to their benefit and our benefit. But we don't need our military vessels sailing. It'd be like allowing China have 20 ships in the Gulf of Mexico, just aggravating us. You know, people would be outraged of that. But we do that all the time. The straits, the Taiwan Straits, they're pretty narrow, considering it. We're over there changing the lines. And then, of course, us aggravation made China decide, well, we're not going to even pretend that we have a division in the straits. So it is also unnecessary, and they don't want to believe that trading with people. Yes, it's imperfect. This whole idea that we say, well, we can't do a thing with China because they violate civil liberties. I said, well, yeah, that is true, and we can talk about that, but we're not going to send troops over there to tell them what to do. And if you want to worry about civil liberties, why don't you worry about the civil liberties of people who are in prisons here in this country? We have more, I think we still do. We have more prisoners than even China has, and a lot of them are for victimless crimes. So it would be a different system. But right now, I'll tell you, it makes no sense for us to just be aggravated and do everything we can to break it down. Just think of this trade war that's been going on for about 6 years now. Sanctions and tariffs and all of these things. The immediate thing is it seems to help somebody. So then there's a trade war. Well, that's essentially we're in a war with Russia right now.
Yeah.
They wanted to trade with us. But we go out of our way to aggravate them because they don't like their borders. Well, we don't like our borders with Mexico, but if we decide we have to do something with the borders in Mexico, I don't think we should want Russia or China to. Can you imagine China coming over here and say, boy, you're mistreating the Mexicans now, and we want to straighten this out or we won't trade with you? It would be ridiculous. So I think that it's better to stay at home and mind one's own business and make sure you take care of the civil liberties. And we could start maybe with looking at Ed Snowden and Assange and talking about their civil liberties.
Well, I think one of the arguments is that protecting Taiwan is not just as a matter of principle, it's to ensure American hegemony in the Pacific region. Suppose we lose Taiwan, it's going to look weak, and it's going to make the Asian allies lose faith in the Americans, the power, right?
That was the whole argument for going into Vietnam, the domino effect. This would happen after we lost 68,000 people in Vietnam. We put our tail between our legs and we left. And we've been fighting that war, wasting lives and money. And think of what changed when all of a sudden we released the domino effect. Soon, within weeks, it would be totally controlled by China. We became more friends. We traveled there. We trade with them. And it wasn't because we took it over and won the war. It was in spite of our stupidity that we ended up, in a much better arrangement. And this could be so much better than what we even have now under these conditions if you just had more of it. But we were trading 10 years ago or so, trading with China and Russia in a much better fashion than we are now. So we have adopted these lack of free market principles,
Right.
and with a currency that is not, is flexible, and we receive all the temporary benefits. We get to print the currency, and therefore, well, our best export now to China are our dollars and buying their stuff. And China saves their money, and then they compete with us, and they outcompete us on some way, and then we get furious.
That's exactly the point. Yes, that's an excellent point, Dr. Paul. Some would say that yes, non-intervention is is a good policy to have, but at what point do we draw the line, Dr. Paul? At what point do we say no to the Chinese spying on us, or no to the Chinese stealing our corporate trade secrets, or no to Russia and China forming an alliance and potentially threatening the security of American interests? At what point do we draw the line and take a step forward?
It depends on what it is.
Yeah.
It depends on what it is. If they're exerting an effort physically against us, like sanctions or blockades or whatever, and looks like it's a military, but that was not happening. So I think that when it comes to breaking, this goes to show that what law are you going to follow? Are you going to follow the law of the United Nations or what? But I still believe that the problems that people have between two countries, if they have a shared interest, like continuing to trade and trust people, that they would voluntarily get together and say, how are we going to settle our disputes? That's what human beings are supposed to do. And that's what, but I agree with you. There's a lot of that right now. But who started this conflict and this contest that's going on? And we're militarily to protect our interests in 150 countries, and then we blame them because they're doing things back to us and they're competing. But no, personally, I think individuals should look to themselves and not be too anxious to blame other people for their faults. And I think we as a country should do that too.
Well, the last question on the Sino-American relations, Dr. Paul. There has been a theory, the Thucydides trap, if you want to call it that, which argues that whenever a rising power comes into the world stage, the existing hegemon gets challenged, and there inevitably will be a war. This was a theory popularized by American political scientist Graham Allison, who studied, I think, over 16 historic instances of an emerging power directly competing with the existing power. And of those 16 instances throughout history, 12 of them have led to a major armed conflict. So the question I think people are asking is whether or not a war with China is inevitable.
Well, let's hope not. But the country that is a hegemon and has control and operation, how did they get it? Did they get it legally, and was it voluntary, or was it artificial? Are these people just rebelling and they want their independence back? You'd have to look at that. But it's they can't do that without the people, without a little bit of effort to have some cooperation. But the getting together is not that difficult. It happens, but it's also, you have the opposition too of people. Well, what if you're dealing with a society that is completely Marxist? They don't even, it's pretty hard to deal with them because they don't even believe there is such a principle as knowing the truth. They don't accept any of it. So you have to do that, but you have to, but the line should be drawn very precisely. If you don't do direct harm to us, we're not going to bomb you, and we're not going to precipitate trouble. We want to trade with you. If we have an argument, we have to have, you should be able to get countries to come together voluntarily and have an arbitrator. That has existed in the past. But if it's just just assuming that we have to have a war, we would have to, if China wants to that we end up with China with the well. Is it our fault? Well, not. It may be the Chinese might say it's your fault. You guys started this, but how did we get to be so big? See, we have an empire, is what we have. Nobody wants to talk about that, but we have an empire, and we have to defend it. Our interests. They always talk about national interest, national security, all that nonsense, because it just isn't true. What we ought to defend are the principles of liberty and the great prosperity that it can create, because the history is there and it's possible. And it should be, it's just, the biggest lobbyist in Washington shouldn't be the military-industrial complex. That's Republican and Democrat. That's where the real problem is. That's why people might not like us and might want to start a war with us. But it's totally unnecessary. And the founders described it as our republic wouldn't last any longer than the people have a moral position. And I think our country suffers a shortage of some of the morality that is required to operate in a free society.
Dr. Paul, before I let you go, I want to ask you one or two questions about Ukraine. Now, as we speak earlier this week, the Pentagon recently announced an additional $1 billion of military aid to Ukraine. Now, you were talking about the American interests overseas and protecting our empire. Okay, so what exactly is the strategic importance of Ukraine to America? And why is the government still spending billions of dollars giving aid, either in the form of humanitarian or military? Yes.
Yeah, in the sense that you ask that, there is no strategic advantage, nothing to offer. Matter of fact, it's exactly the opposite. Our national security is threatened by us being over there because we're in poor relationships with Russia. And I fear the fact that, with all this military buildup, that we're going to have a false flag or an accident and somebody's going to get killed. And before you know it, everybody's, sort of preparing for that. But that is, but do we need Ukraine? No, we don't. If there's a problem over there, the Ukrainians and their neighbors have to solve it. And yes, from our viewpoint, it might be imperfect, but why should we be part of a NATO that, where we don't even follow the promises that we made, that we would keep our missiles away from the borders of Russia? And then when they get a leader in Ukraine that happens to be an elected leader sympathetic to Russia, then we go in and participate in a coup to get rid of them. That's the kind of stuff that is so unnecessary and is a threat to our national security.
Some would say, well, there's two arguments to be made. I would like you to address both of them, Dr. Paul, and the conversation here. The first argument is that as victims of a war, if you like to call them that, the Ukrainians have suffered greatly in the hands of the Russian forces, and so the Americans have a fiduciary duty to protect victims of any sort of military conquest by sending humanitarian and/or military and/or financial aid. The second argument is that suppose the Americans do nothing with Ukraine, the Chinese will take it upon themselves as an opportunity to invade Taiwan because they will see this as a precedent of American weakness.
Well, the aid business, if there's Ukrainian people suffering, which they are, because we help precipitate the problems over there by the coup of 2014, but it doesn't prohibit them from getting help. Because there are Ukrainians that live in this country, and they're very sympathetic. Some even went over there and thought they wanted to volunteer and fight. But it should be voluntary. That's all. Help them out if you believe it. I'm not going to. In Congress, I would have never voted to send your kids over to Ukraine, to make the conditions better. So, and what if China takes advantage of this? That's another argument for non-intervention, because it's the intervention that we have that we stir up the trouble, and they're more likely to take advantage of this because I don't think China would be preparing, to do this other than the fact that the aggravation. But who are we to decide that absolutely, no matter what, like Pelosi, she more or less said, we will protect you just as if you were, part of NATO. That's where the problems come from. Yes, there's a problem over there, and it's existed 100 years, 1,000 years. How long has it been? So, and I think Taiwan has done such an exceptional job, and it wasn't like they before these last couple years, the Taiwanese and the Chinese, they actually talked to each other, and there was some trade going on there. So that's what has to be encouraged, which is discouraged once we get involved with our ships and planes and submarines and nuclear missiles and and then we demonstrate, then you get other people doing the same thing. We have missiles too. It's a mentality that exists that has to be reversed, but that's a moral issue as much as a military issue.
Final point, Dr. Paul, I'll let you go. I think the ultimate power move from China is exactly like you said, to open dialogue with Taiwan and encourage peaceful reunification. Suppose the Taiwanese people, just suppose they vote through their own, free will to join China, which is, a bit of a stretch, but possible, considering that the KMT party is pro-reunification. That would be the ultimate power move, because then the United States would be stuck. They can't actually take any action against that reunification.
No, I think the suggestion is great, because that's the way some of these problems should solve. When there was a leader in Ukraine elected, he was leaning away from Europe toward Russia. Why didn't they have a referendum? Why wasn't it recognized that there's self-determination? Maybe the eastern part of Ukraine would have voted, to go, but nobody wants to do that. But that would have been a solution. But they weren't even really talking about that is the problem, because traditionally you have to look tough. There's always the warmongers and the people who make money off war. And there's the military-industrial complex, that influences our Congress, and they do it. The thing of it is, it's self-limited, because it's right now it's all done by debt and printing money, creating a huge economic bubble that is not going to have a deflation and move back to normal. No, it's going to burst and cause a lot of trouble. And people have to realize that there's a better way than for us to just, get antagonistic to all these people and tell them, we'll tell you how to solve your problems. If not, we'll we have foreign policy that said, do it our way and we'll give you money. If you don't do your money, we'll bomb you. And there's a different foreign policy. Get along with them.
All right. Well, Dr. Paul, you've been very generous with your time today. It's always an honor to have you on the show. Thank you again today.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
And thank you for watching Kitco News. I'm David Lin. Stay tuned for more, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel.